But first, let's rewind and see where it all began. So CoreCivic was the world's first private prison company which pioneered the idea of running prisons for a profit. In 2022 alone, they did a combined revenue of more than $4.2 billion. Now here's a shocking fact. Hi, we're here to discuss a very thought-provoking topic today, which is the private prison industry in the United States. We will discuss the history, the business model, and some startling statistics about this industry overall. Apart from the United States, there are 11 other countries that have private prisons in place, which are England, Scotland, Germany, France, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Brazil, and Chile. But first, let's rewind and see where it all began. So private prisons were born in 1980 when the US government decided to have stricter laws, mandatory imprisonments, and the overall drug culture in US gave way to private prisons. This led to an increased population in public prisons, and this is when Thomas Beasley, Don Hutto, and Robert Cran decided to start the Correction Corporation of America, which is today known as CoreCivic. So CoreCivic was the world's first private prison company which pioneered the idea of running prisons for a profit. Today, CoreCivic and the GEO Group are the two biggest players in the private prison industry in US. In 2022 alone, they did a combined revenue of more than $4.2 billion from a total of 180 facilities, including jails, detention centers, etc. These detention centers, jails, and prisons, collectively they housed 160,957 beds. Now the question arises, how did private prisons become an industry of its own? And the answer lies in the business model. So private prisons are for-profit institutions, meaning they are run by private corporations with the aim to make profits by housing inmates. So these corporations enter into contracts with the state and the federal government to house prisoners. Now here's how these corporations make sure that they stay in business. Now roughly 3/4 of these contracts have occupancy clauses. They're also known as bed clauses. Now this means that the state agree to supply minimum number of prisoners at that prison facility. A majority of these contracts guarantee that a minimum of 80 to 100% of the beds of that prison facility will be occupied by prisoners. If the contracting state fails to supply the X number of prisoners to the prison facility, then it must pay a fine to the company for running the prison. In effect, a state is paying the corporation irrespective of whether the bed is filled or not by a prisoner. Now, because the state government is penalized for not fulfilling its promise to a specific corporation, they are incentivized to incarcerate people and keep the beds filled. Now, needless to say that these private prisons aggressively lobby for harsher criminal laws and policies just to keep themselves in profit. The United States has a population of less than 5% of the total world population. However, 3/4 of the total prison population in the world is from US. Now this says a lot about the social welfare system and the impact of privatization of prisons in America. In 2019, approximately 116,000 inmates were incarcerated by private prisons, which accounts for a total of 8% of the total prison population in the US. The critics have long suspected that the private prison corporations often skim through the best inmates with the lowest needs in order to maximize costs. Some critics argue that the private prisoners are in fact modern-day slaves. Now here's a shocking fact. There is a concept of convict leasing, which means that companies all across US hire prisoners to do the work. Hundreds of companies in the United States employ these private prisoners as laborers. And these private prison corporations such as CoreCivic and the GEO Group pay about 90 cents to $4 a day per prisoner for a day's work. which is way less than a minimum wage worker. The corporations not only benefit from cheap labor, but they are also given tax incentives by the government if they employ labor from these prisons. The scary part is that the money earned by these prisoners is often pocketed by the private corporations, and they're hardly paid anything. So this is a direct form of slavery. An additional source of income for the private prison corporations is often the telephone charges that they have in place for prisoners to call back home. These services are outsourced, but the prisoners are charged roughly around $25 per call if they want to speak to their loved ones. Now, as I wrap up, it's pretty evident that the private prison corporation business does not add to the overall welfare system of the country.